Using their muscular and nervous systems, animals exhibit complex behavior. Let's look at these. Able to define fixed action pattern, sign stimulus, innate behavior, learning, associative learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, observational learning, imprinting, spatial learning, social learning, foraging, and parental care. Be able to identify what selective pressures exist on behavior. Identify when learned behaviors may be favored over innate as well as the inverse, and that will be more of a think it through than in this lecture. And define each type of mating system and give an example. There are many types of behavior, and we can place them on a continuum from learned behaviors to innate behaviors. Learned behaviors, or plastic behaviors, are highly modified by the environment, and we're going to look at a couple of those, such as when an organism encounters a novel stimulus and has to figure out how to work with it. An innate behavior is less variable or changeable and is often developmentally fixed, such as mating calls for most species. Innate behaviors are genetically determined. They are developmentally fixed, meaning they occur at certain times during the lifespan. A larval beetle is not going to attempt mating, but an adult beetle is going to attempt mating. And these occur without prior experience with the stimulus. It's not like a beetle, if it wants to mate, has to read a manual on it and try to look at multiple different models. Individuals exhibit similar behavior despite differences in cues. That can be internal cues or external cues. And still requires environmental stimuli. And that environmental stimuli can be called a sign stimulus or can be called a releaser. It is something that is going to cause the innate behavior to occur. One type of innate behavior is a fixed action pattern, or FAP. And this is a sequence of actions that are unlearned, and they're linked to a sign stimulus. And once initiated, they usually keep on going until there's some sort of a completion. One example of this is if a stickleback sees another fish with a red belly, it will start an aggressive chase response against the other fish with the red belly until the other fish with the red belly is gone. If a goose sees something round and white near its nest, it will reach out its neck and begin rolling that object back. If you stop the object from moving halfway through, such as by pulling it away, the goose will continue the rolling motion even in the absence of the object. That is a fixed action pattern. And we're going to look at a specific fixed action pattern with bees removing dead larvae. This is called hygienic behavior. Now, there are two genes which are in response for this. First one is to uncap the cell and expose the larva, and the other one is to discard the larva. We are going to look at how a cross between these would occur in nature, given that both of these are recessive traits. We're not going to be doing this in this video lecture. Migration and communication are types of spatial responses. Migration is long and regular change in location. The need to migrate is innate, but spatial learning occurs, and that is going to start the direction and landmarks of migration, that they're actually looking for certain landmarks to move from landmark to landmark. Now, this isn't true for all creatures. Some just move in a general direction for a certain amount of time. We can also look at communication as a method of behavior. This is a transmission and reception of signals. Being able to receive communication or being able to transmit communication is innate, such as bees using their waggling responses or moths using pheromones. But the signals being given, such as how fast a bee waggles and how much they dance, that is altered based on the information being communicated. So you can see that these behaviors are in part innate, but they do have some learned components as well. How do we know if something is innate or learned? Well, we can do twin studies where you separate twins at birth and give them to different environments, such as this was done in your example of cross-fostering in mice in your book. Twin studies are therefore using genetically identical individuals, so you know the only thing that changes is the environment in which they're raised. So fostering these uses different parents to see what the conditions of raising. We can also look at imprinting when we're dealing with how organisms respond to their parents. And this is irreversible learned behavior. It can only occur during the critical period. There's always that famous thing in cartoons where you have a bird hatching out of an egg and seeing something and immediately deciding, that's my mommy. Well, that's imprinting. and that can only occur for geese, for example, during the first 3 days. Do you see this condor chick being raised by its very ugly parent? That's not an ugly parent. That's actually a glove. That's right. The researchers who were trying to raise condor chicks were trying to use those gloves so that condors would imprint on what is closer to the correct species. They need a certain cue from the environment. And although most of the cues I've been mentioning are visual, this can also be scent-based, such as in this vole. Imprinting is an important way for a species to know what its parent is, which is my cat Muffin, who was separated from his mom at day 1, has imprinted only on humans and only deals with human cues. Highly plastic behavior, a good example of this, is habituation. It's the loss of responsiveness to unimportant stimuli. Consider, for an example, a scarecrow that sits out in a field for far too long. The crows will eventually realize it is not a threat, so they will lose their responsiveness to the stimulus because the stimulus is unimportant. Or a garbage truck driving up to a house and a dog seeing it the first time is probably going to lose their mind. After a lengthy time, though, they'll stop barking at it because they realize it's an unimportant stimulus. Humans at Western Washington University are a good example of an unimportant stimulus to deer. Deer are not threatened by these humans and will walk right around them because humans do not attack deer in this environment. How does learning occur? Well, we're going to look at least 3 ways of how learning occurs. And this is associating a stimulus with a response. There's classical conditioning. This is the example of Pavlov's dog. You have an unconditioned stimulus, such as food, and an unconditioned response, such as salivation in the presence of food. You have a neutral stimulus, such as ringing a bell. This does not make a dog salivate under normal conditions. However, during a conditioning phase, you give this bell in association with the unconditioned stimulus. The organism then associates the cue, which is a neutral stimulus, with a positive reward, the food, and will eventually show the same conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus. So the unconditioned response becomes a conditioned response when it is in response to a stimulus that is not the unconditioned stimulus. There's also operant conditioning, which is trial and error. This coyote is full of porcupine quills. It fooled around and it found out, and it will now, hopefully, learn not to attack porcupines again. That is a trial. It made an error. A blue jay that eats a monarch butterfly will then vomit because monarch butterflies are toxic. That blue jay will then learn not to eat monarch butterflies and will associate that pattern with the response of it vomiting, and that is operant conditioning. Observational learning has a lot less cost associated with it because this is where one watches others and copies their behavior. We can see this as chimpanzees learn to use tools to get termites out of termite mounds or to crush nuts. They watch one another. You can see that baby watching the parents there. And as the parent crushes the nuts, the baby learns that you need 2 rocks and you smash them together and that will open up a nut. You can also see this in the whooping crane reconditioning project where they taught whooping cranes not only how to fly, but how and where to migrate. This is observational learning. And observational learning gives rise to something called social learning when you're learning through observing others within a social group, which causes something called culture, a system of information transfer through social learning. You can have culture, such as the example of macaws on Koshima Island. What they do is when they find a sweet potato, they will wash it in the water. Why? Well, to get sand off of it. Someone was throwing sweet potatoes on the beach, and one of these macaws learned to wash off the sand of the sweet potato before eating it. After learning this, it passed this information on to the other macaws on the island. Not all behavior is simple stimulus response. A lot of it has to do with something called optimality, and that's going to be a measurement of the costs and the benefits. What are costs? Well, survival and reproductive success. Any lack of those is a cost. Any increase in those is a benefit. And how behavior influences fitness is what behavioral ecologists will look at. Fitness, remember, is an organism's genetic contribution to future generations relative to other individuals of the same species. Basically, leaving more offspring than the others around you. So how does one increase their fitness by optimal behaviors? Well, a measure of costs and benefits. First, benefits are usually in terms of fitness. There's more survival and more reproductive success. Costs, 3 main categories. Energy, if you're using energy for one activity and you could be doing something else at the time, that's principle of allocation. Every organism has only so much energy. Risk, the increased likelihood of injury or death. This frog that is calling is taking on a risk of being found by a predator in the hope for an opportunity to get to mate. Also, there's an opportunity while performing one activity like feeding, an organism cannot perform another like mating. So, this leads to optimality theory, which predicts that traits that maximize the difference between the costs and the benefits will be selected via natural selection. And this can be applied to breeding, migration, foraging, and defense. We are here going to apply it to mating systems. Mating systems are optimal. What an organism can mate with, how many mates they can have, is something optimal. Not all organisms can just mate with every other organism of their species and hope for a maximum level of reproduction. It doesn't work that way. So let's look over these mating systems. First off, there's monogamy. That's where there's one male and one female forming a pair bond for life. Polygyny is one male and several to many females. They do form pair bonds. Polyandry is several males to one female, and they do form pair bonds. Polygyandry is several males and several females, and they do form pair bonds. Promiscuity is, well, there's no pair bonds, so it's just promiscuous. Let's take a closer look. Here are examples of monogamy. Emperor penguins are one of the best examples of monogamy. Coming up also are beavers and prairie voles. There's one male, one female. They form a pair bond, often for multiple mating seasons. And in monogamy, there's often no sexual dimorphism. The males and the females generally look the same. In polygamy, you have a couple different methods here. You have pair bonds. Polygyny is several females and one male. Polyandry is several males and one female. And polygyandry is several males and several females. Take a closer look into let's look at polygyny. Polygyny, one example would be bison. One male will have many females, and they will form a herd together with the calves of that one male or bull and the many females or cows. Polyandry, the female will mate with several males. So this is spotted sandpipers and pipefish are examples of this. In the pipefish, the female will actually lay the eggs on the male's belly, and the male will raise the eggs. This allows the female to lay eggs on several males' bellies, and the males have to raise the eggs of that female. Polygyandry is not just a free-for-all where mating occurs randomly. No, there are going to be pair bonds. An example of this is lions. There are coalitions of related males. So there may be 2 or 3 males in a pride and a bunch of females. Now, one male is going to mate more than the others, and that in itself is a selective pressure covered in another class. This is polygyandry because there are several males and several females. Promiscuity has no lasting relationships, such as the Himalayan monal pheasant. These males display a whole bunch. They show themselves off. A female will come and mate and leave. And they don't even call each other the next morning. She just goes and lays eggs. So other examples, satin bowerbird, blue grouse, these often lead to extremes in sexual selection and sexual dimorphism, where all the male is doing is advertising a whole bunch and giving some sperm. And the female is going to be laying the eggs and doing most of the raising.